You've been told faith can move mountains, but what do you do when the mountain explodes and races directly toward you? In 1919, the night sky over Java turned violently red, as a terrifying river of boiling mud swallowed everything in its path, wiping out entire villages in minutes. One woman refused to run. While thousands fled in terror, she simply fell to her knees in her fragile wooden house, clutching her tithe, and God stopped a volcano to save her. What happened next is unbelievable. Java, Indonesia, the year was 1919. The tropical heat was suffocating. It pressed down like a heavy, oppressive blanket over the dusty roads of the rural villages. The air was thick with humidity clinging to the skin and making every breath feel like a chore. Dust rose in small swirling clouds with every step taken, and towering above it all, casting a long, jagged, inescapable shadow over the entire landscape was Mount Kelud, a dormant giant. Living right in the shadow of that massive mountain was a small Chinese woman named Li Hua. History often remembers the great generals, the powerful kings, the massive movements of nations. It rarely pays attention to a woman like Li Hua. She did not have a platform. She did not have wealth. She did not have an army of followers. What she had was a long, difficult road ahead of her. Every single weekend she walked for miles under that blistering sun. The journey was not a casual stroll. It was an arduous, exhausting trek across uneven dirt paths. Her clothes clung to her back with sweat. Her feet ached with a dull throb. Her throat was constantly parched. Yet she made this long journey without fail, just to reach a small, obscure Christian church located far away from her home. And as she walked, her fingers tightly gripped something in the pocket of her dress, a few small coins. It was a meager sum. She had saved it by deliberately skipping her own sparse meals, denying herself food so she could offer something to her Creator. It was her tithe. When I read about her holding those coins, I immediately think about the ancient words of the prophet Malachi chapter 3, verse 10, "Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts." Li Hua was living out those exact words in the dust of Java. She was not bringing out of her excess. She was bringing her very survival. She was bringing her heart. But her incredible sacrifice was not met with admiration by the people around her. In fact, it was met with open hostility. You see, the village she lived in was a tight-knit community bound together by centuries of ancient traditions. Li Hua was entirely alone in her faith. She was the only Christian in a village deeply steeped in traditional spiritual beliefs. Every time she stepped out of her fragile wooden house, she felt the weight of their eyes on her, the hushed whispers, the sharp pointing fingers. The isolation was an invisible prison. Her neighbors simply did not understand her devotion to an unseen God. To them, she was a fool. A local witch doctor, a man who commanded deep respect and fear in the community, made her a target. He would stand in the village square and openly ridicule her. He told the villagers that her Western God was weak and distant. He loudly proclaimed that this foreign deity had absolutely no power in their land, not here, not under the watchful, brooding presence of the ancient volcano spirits. Day after day, the mockery grew louder, the social isolation deepened. When she walked to the market, people would turn their backs. She was an outcast in her own home, bearing the brunt of their scorn. But while the village mocked her faith, she chose to kneel. I have to pause here for a second. To be honest, I used to think that true faith meant you were always surrounded by a massive supportive church family. I thought revival always happened in packed stadiums with thousands of people singing together. But researching Li Hua's story, it broke my heart, and it completely changed my perspective. Imagine the sheer emotional exhaustion she faced. Imagine walking miles in the punishing heat to give away the very little money you have to survive, only to come back to a village that laughs at the God you love. Imagine having absolutely no one to pray with you, no one to hold your hand when you are tired. Some of you watching this right now, you know exactly how Li Hua felt. Maybe you are the only believer in your family. Every holiday dinner, you sit at the table and face the subtle jokes, the eye rolls when you pray over your meal, the constant draining feeling of being the outsider in your own bloodline. Or maybe you are the only Christian in your workplace, surrounded by people who think your devotion is outdated and foolish. You sit in your room at night feeling utterly exhausted. You wonder if your quiet, lonely prayers are even making a difference. You wonder if God actually sees how incredibly hard it is to stand alone in the dark. He does. He sees every single tear of isolation. He honors every lonely prayer. If you are the only believer in your family or your workplace right now, I want you to type, "I am not alone," in the comments. Let this community be your church family today. We are reading and we are praying for you. Because what Li Hua did not know, what her cruel mockers did not know, was that her silent, lonely faith was about to be tested. Tested by a force of nature so violent and catastrophic it would rewrite history forever. Deep beneath the earth, the mountain was waking up. May 19th, 1919. The day began like any other, but by late afternoon an eerie, oppressive stillness settled over the entire region. The air grew impossibly heavy. Up near the jagged summit of Mount Kelud, something catastrophic was brewing, deep underground. The massive crater lake, holding 38 million cubic meters of water, began to heat up. It started to boil. A pungent, thick smell of sulfur drifted down the slopes, choking the air. Animals sensed the impending doom long before the human residents did. Flocks of birds abruptly abandoned the trees, darkening the sky as they fled. Wild dogs howled frantically at the unseen danger. Then, as evening approached, the night sky turned a violent, bruised red. The villagers stepped out of their homes, pointing up at the unnatural, terrifying glow reflecting off the clouds. The witch doctor watched in stunned silence. The very people who had mocked Li Hua's prayers now stared at the sky with growing, undeniable unease. They noticed the warning signs, but the mountain gave them no time to react. It was already too late. The mountain did not just erupt, it exploded. The sound was absolutely deafening. It sounded like 1,000 freight trains colliding at once. The sheer devastating force of the eruption blasted the boiling crater lake high into the air, instantly mixing millions of gallons of scalding water with millions of tons of volcanic ash, pumice, and shattered rock. This lethal mixture created a lahar, a massive, unstoppable river of boiling mud. This river of death did not slowly creep down the mountain. It accelerated. Driven by gravity and immense pressure, it tore down the steep slopes at speeds reaching 60 kilometers per hour. The historical accounts of that night are almost too terrifying to comprehend. Massive ancient trees were snapped in half like dry twigs. Huge boulders were tossed around like pebbles in a stream. The boiling mud swallowed absolutely everything in its path. Entire fields vanished in seconds. Homes were crushed instantly under the sheer weight of the rapidly moving debris. Panic entirely consumed the village. People grabbed whatever small possessions they could carry and ran blindly into the pitch-black night. The neighbors who had laughed at Li Hua's unseen god were now shrieking in sheer terror, completely at the mercy of the angry mountain. The local witch doctor, who had confidently claimed power over the local spirits, abandoned his incantations and fled for his own life. The air was filled with absolute chaos, the terrifying mechanical roar of the earth tearing itself apart, the desperate, frantic footsteps of people running for high ground. But right in the middle of this absolute pandemonium, the camera of history zooms in on one tiny, fragile wooden house. Li Hua did not run. While the ground violently shook beneath her feet, rattling the thin wooden walls of her home until they threatened to splinter, she did not pack a bag. She did not join the frantic, screaming stampede outside her window. She stood in the center of her small, dimly lit room. She listened to the mountain tearing the world apart outside her door. She heard the screams. She felt the intense, suffocating heat approaching. And then, in the face of certain impending death, she did the only thing she knew how to do. As the mountain roared and the village ran in terror, she chose to kneel. She bowed her head, she closed her eyes tightly, she clasped her worn hands together and began to pray. She offered a silent, steadfast prayer in a room that was minutes away from being entirely obliterated. I want you to really picture this incredible contrast. Outside her walls, there was absolute, unfiltered terror. Men and women relying on their own strength, their own speed, their own desperate attempts to outrun a force of nature. But inside that fragile wooden shack, there was absolute divine peace. Li Hua had surrendered her survival to the god she walked miles to worship. She anchored her soul to the unseen. Outside, the boiling lahar had reached the very edge of the village. It was a towering wall of black, churning mud, standing as tall. The sheer kinetic force of the lahar was enough to pulverize solid concrete bridges, let alone a simple wooden structure. It crushed the first row of houses, effortlessly flattening them into the earth. Then it took the second row. It was moving with terrifying, indiscriminate precision, wiping away generations of history in a single sweeping motion. And it was hurtling directly toward Li Hua's wooden shack. She remained entirely still on her knees. The temperature inside her house spiked dramatically. The deafening, grinding roar of the mud was now mere feet away, violently vibrating through the thin floorboards beneath her knees. The shadows in the room danced wildly as the red glow of the disaster engulfed her windows. The wall of death was about to strike. The impact. When the boiling wall of mud finally reached Li Hua's home, the ground shuddered with such extreme violence that it should have shattered every wooden beam instantly. Li Hua heard a sharp, terrifying crack just outside her door. She squeezed her eyes shut, holding her breath, waiting for the burning weight of the lahar to crush her into the earth. She waited for the sudden dark end. But the end did not come. Seconds passed in absolute agony, then minutes. The suffocating, lethal heat was still there, pressing intensely against the thin wooden walls of her home. The mechanical, grinding roar of the mud was still deafening, rushing past her ears like an endless string of colliding freight trains. The sheer kinetic energy of the disaster violently shook the floorboards beneath her knees. But the walls did not collapse, the roof did not cave in, the door was not breached. She remained on her knees in the center of the room, completely untouched. Many hours later, morning finally broke over the devastated island of Java. The sun struggled to pierce through a thick, choking blanket of gray ash that hung suspended in the air, casting a pale, unnatural light over the region. As the light finally touched the ground, it revealed a landscape of absolute, unimaginable devastation. The tight-knit village, with its generations of complex history, its bustling local markets, its ancient temples, and its deep-rooted traditions, was completely gone. In its place was a vast, desolate sea of steaming black mud. Everything had been violently wiped off the face of the earth. Every towering tree had been uprooted. Every stone bridge had been pulverized. Every home had been swallowed. Everything, except for one single object. Standing entirely alone in the absolute middle of a blackened, smoking wasteland was a single, fragile wooden shack. It looked surreal. It looked like an impossible glitch in reality. The structure was made of weak timber with paper-thin walls that should have been swept away by a strong gust of wind, let alone a volcanic lahar. Yet it stood there, perfectly intact. Slowly, the surviving villagers, who had managed to scramble to the high hills during the frantic night, began to descend. They walked like ghosts through the thick, knee-deep ash, weeping uncontrollably as they searched for the remains of their homes, their livelihoods, and their missing loved ones. They found absolutely nothing. The geography of their home had been erased. And then, through the gray haze, they saw it. They stopped dead in their tracks. A crowd slowly began to gather, standing at the edge of the hardened, cooling mud, staring in absolute, stunned disbelief. When the villagers and the dispatched Dutch colonial rescue teams carefully made their way across the still warm mud to investigate the lone structure, they could not comprehend what their eyes were showing them. The rescue workers' men trained to assess disaster zones scientifically were utterly baffled. The boiling lahar, a force of nature that had snapped ancient trees and pulverized solid concrete throughout the valley, had not hit the house. As the colossal wave of mud had hurtled directly toward Li Hua's fragile walls, it did not crush them. Instead, right at the very edge of her property line, the terrifying river of death had inexplicably split. It had parted into two separate, distinct streams. The boiling mud flowed violently past the left side of the house, and it flowed violently past the right side of the house, before seamlessly merging back together just a few feet behind her property. But it was what caused the split that left the colonial rescuers and the villagers completely speechless. A massive, jagged boulder, a massive chunk of the mountain, weighing several tons, had been violently swept up in the eruption and carried down the slope by the mud at terrifying speeds. By all known laws of physics, a boulder of that immense size, traveling at that velocity, should have slammed directly into Li Hua's home, flattening it instantly like a fragile toy. Instead, the enormous rock had slid to a sudden, inexplicable grinding halt. It stopped exactly a few inches away from her front wall. It did not even scratch the weathered wood. Once that massive boulder locked firmly into place in the earth, its sheer size and shape acted as a perfect, immovable wedge. It became a physical divine shield, parting the massive river of boiling mud perfectly around the small house. While the entire region was tragically swallowed by the angry volcano, Li Hua's home sat in an impossible, perfectly dry pocket of grace. When they opened her door, they found her exactly where the night had begun. Still alive, there was not a single drop of mud inside her home. The local witch doctor stood in the gathering crowd, staring blankly at the massive boulder wedge. He was completely silent. He had spent months loudly mocking her Western god, claiming that her foreign deity was weak and had absolutely no power under the dark, brooding shadow of Mount Kelud. But as he looked at the surviving woman stepping out of her untouched home into the morning light, the truth was undeniable. Her god had just commanded the mountain. I want you to pause and think about this for a moment. You see, the ultimate miracle of Li Hua's story is not that the mountain remained dormant. Sometimes in our own lives, we pray desperately for God to stop the disaster before it starts. We pray for Him to remove the trial, to heal the sickness immediately, to stop the financial collapse before it hits our bank account. We want Him to keep our personal volcano dormant. But sometimes He allows the mountain to explode. Sometimes He allows the terrifying trial to rush directly towards you at full speed. He does not do this because He has abandoned you. He does this because He wants to demonstrate a level of divine protection that will leave the entire world utterly speechless. He did not stop the massive lahar from destroying the region. He simply parted the boiling mud right where she was kneeling. When you feel like you are the only believer in your family, or when you feel completely overwhelmed by a disaster rushing toward your life today, I want you to remember this powerful picture. A tiny faithful woman kneeling behind a massive boulder, completely untouched by the fire of the world. This is the exact literal promise found in the book of Psalms, chapter 91, verse 7. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. Li Hua lived that verse. And if you belong to Him, you live under that exact same protection today. The disaster may surround you, the world may mock you, but in the presence of God, you are in the ultimate safe house. Whenever you hear a story like this, human nature instantly tries to rationalize it. The skeptical mind wants to immediately brush this incredible event off as a myth, a local legend, a comforting fairy tale invented by desperate people to make themselves feel better about a violent, unpredictable world. But Li Hua's story is not a myth. It is not just recorded in old, dusty church bulletins or passed down through oral tradition. It is permanently etched into the rigid scientific and geological record of Indonesia. The catastrophic eruption of Mount Kelud in 1919 remains one of the most devastating volcanic events in modern recorded history. The Dutch colonial government meticulously documented the horrific aftermath of the disaster. The historical records grimly confirm that the boiling lahar wiped out over 100 villages and tragically claimed the lives of more than 5,000 people in a matter of hours. The sheer geographical alteration of the landscape was so severe that it was studied by global volcanologists for decades. And right there, explicitly documented, in the middle of the absolute destruction, is the physical, undeniable fact of a single wooden house left standing in an endless ocean of hardened mud, protected by a massive volcanic boulder acting as a wedge. Let us just think about the mathematics of this miracle for a second. Let us think about the utterly impossible odds. A boulder weighing several tons is violently ejected from a subterranean crater. It is immediately caught in a massive river of boiling mud traveling at 60 kilometers per hour. It tumbles blindly for miles down a steep, chaotic slope, smashing through dense forests, obliterating wildlife, and pulverizing concrete bridges. What are the realistic odds that this specific, massive boulder would perfectly align with the exact center of Li Hua's tiny house? What are the mathematical chances that the boulder would suddenly lose its immense forward momentum and grind to a complete halt exactly a few inches away from her fragile front door? If that boulder had stopped just 2 meters earlier, it would not have parted the mud wide enough to protect the structure. The boiling lahar would have easily collapsed the sides of her house, flooding the interior. If that massive rock had traveled just a fraction of a second longer, if it had stopped just 1 meter later, its sheer kinetic momentum would have crushed Li Hua and her home into fine dust. It had to stop at the exact microscopic pinpoint on the map to create the perfect aerodynamic wedge required to seamlessly split a moving liquid of that extreme mass and viscosity. You can call that a bizarre coincidence if you want to. You can call it a statistical anomaly of physics. But when a poor woman who walks miles to faithfully give her tithe falls to her knees and prays to the creator of the universe, and a multi-ton rock perfectly shields her from a boiling wave of death, I do not call that a coincidence. I call that divine mathematics. I call that the undeniable fingerprint of God. So, what happened to the mockers? What happened to the tight-knit community that had relentlessly ridiculed her devotion? What happened to the neighbors who had sharply turned their backs on her in the local market? When the thick ash finally settled, those surviving villagers had lost absolutely everything. Their homes, their ancient shrines, their generational wealth, their sense of security, it was all buried beneath 30 feet of hardening black mud. The traditional volcano gods, they had so fiercely defended the spirits the witch doctor claimed to control, had offered them no protection whatsoever. But as they stood shivering in the ruins of their shattered lives, they looked over at Li Hua's property. They saw her fragile wooden house completely untouched by the devastation. Suddenly, the Western god did not seem so weak and distant anymore. Slowly, quietly, the people of the village began to approach her wooden door. They did not come to point fingers. They did not come to laugh. They came with a deep, undeniable hunger. The local witch doctor, the very man who loudly proclaimed that her god had no power in their land, was completely silenced by the massive physical evidence standing right in front of him in the ashes. They came to Li Hua, the woman they had completely isolated and rejected, and they asked her a simple, desperate question: "Can you tell us about the God who commands the mountain?" Her lonely, agonizing walk of faith was never just about her. God did not just protect Li Hua so she could comfortably survive. He protected her so that her tiny house could become a towering, indisputable monument of his supreme authority to a broken community that desperately needed him. That one tiny, isolated seed of faith, planted in the dry dust of bitter persecution, watered by the silent tears of her isolation, eventually blossomed into something magnificent. History tells us that her miraculous survival sparked a profound spiritual awakening in that region. People who had violently rejected the gospel suddenly surrendered their lives to Christ, completely transformed by the physical evidence of his divine protection. She thought she was just giving her meager tithe. She thought she was just praying a lonely, desperate prayer in the dark. She had absolutely no idea she was actually laying the foundation for a revival. When you stand alone in your faith today, when you face the subtle mockery of your unbelieving family or your secular workplace, remember this: your quiet faithfulness is not being wasted. God is meticulously using your steadfast devotion to build an undeniable testimony. And when the inevitable storms of life hit, the very people who mocked your faith will be the very same people who come knocking on your door asking how you managed to find such incredible peace in the fire. When we look at the incredible life of Li Hua, we are reminded of a beautiful, comforting truth. God does not need you to be powerful. He does not demand that you possess the strength to literally move mountains on your own. He simply asks you to remain faithful exactly where you are standing. Even when you feel like your resources are too small, even when you think your quiet tithe or your silent prayers are completely useless because there is no one else around who shares your faith, even when the world mocks your devotion, God sees it all. He sees your lonely walk and He honors your quiet sacrifice. He knows how to build a fortress around a faithful heart. Perhaps today you are staring down a mountain in your own life. It might be a devastating medical diagnosis, a sudden financial collapse, or a family situation that feels like it is violently erupting out of control. You might be surrounded by people who completely misunderstand your faith, people who tell you that praying is a waste of time. Do not lose heart. Do not run in panic. Choose to kneel. If you are facing a terrifying mountain today, if you are feeling completely overwhelmed and alone in the dark, drop a "pray for me" in the comments below right now. You do not have to fight this battle by yourself. Let this community be your safe house today. Let us stand with you in the shadow of whatever mountain you are facing. I leave you with the comforting words of Isaiah chapter 43, verse 2. When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee. And through the rivers they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned. May the God who commands the mountain be your absolute, unshakable peace today. Amen.